the Prime Minister on the fresh tariff tensions between the U.S. and Canada.
We have a significant trade surplus. The Americans have a significant trade surplus with us on steel, which means we buy steel from them, they buy steel from us. The integrated nature of our supply chains means that there will be significant disruption in Canada, obviously, but also in the United States. We buy more steel from the United States than any other country, and disruptions to this integrated market would be significant and serious.
That, of course, the Prime Minister in Barrie, Ontario earlier today. And another strong voice on the issue, Unifor National President Jerry Dias, whose union represents 40,000 workers in the auto industry and thousands more in the steel and aluminum sectors.
There's no question that the U.S. does not want a deal. It's clear, because you don't start trade negotiations by being punitive. So look, if they don't want a deal, it's crystal clear. Canada should have the courage to say enough is enough and just walk away.
And joining me now is former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman. Welcome back. Always great to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be back in Ottawa.
Excellent. Let me start off with a tweet by Donald Trump today. He said, "Trade wars are good and easy to win," a claim many within its own party, the Republicans, and those on Wall Street are rejecting. What do you make of that?
Trade wars are bad, and you almost never win on a trade war. So in this particular case, and it would not probably surprise you that maybe in other tweets, I don't agree with the president at this point.
Do you think his threat of imposing these tariffs, these punitive tariffs, do you think it's all bluster, or do you think he would actually follow through on them?
I guess we won't know till next week. But you know what? He threatened to get out of Paris, and he got out of Paris. He threatened to get out of TPP. Lo and behold, we're out of TPP. He threatened DACA, and we have a bunch of dreamers now in the United States trying to figure out their path ahead. You know, I think some of his campaign threats have been fulfilled, unfortunately.
But in this particular case, you've got a policy that would be disastrous potentially to American workers. I mean, the U.S. is very much reliant on aluminum and on steel. This would cost a lot of jobs in the U.S.
Oh, economically, this makes no sense whatsoever. You have economists, you have business leaders, you have the Wall Street Journal, you have political leaders from both parties almost universally saying that this is going to be painful, this will cost jobs, this will raise prices, and as we heard from the Prime Minister, potentially cause retaliation even at some point by countries affected by this. And you have to think about that.
Retaliation, you know, I know it's difficult for you to weigh in on something that Canada would do, given that you were the former U.S. ambassador to Canada. But what do you think those retaliatory measures could look like?
Gosh, I don't know. And it's hard for me to even think about this, because when we think about the word trade war, war is conflict. And having conflict with Canada is the farthest thing that I ever thought we would be talking about at this point. You know, the Peace Bridge, the Peace Arch, that's in Blaine, Washington, right at the border, talks about the 100 years after the War of 1812 and children from a common mother and brethren, you know, living together in unity. The reality is that we are so intertwined. We have worked together on so many things around the world, including defense, which part of the argument here is that this is meant to strengthen the U.S. defense, where in reality, U.S. defense and Canadian defense are one. We've worked together. We do it in NORAD. We do it in NATO. Our troops train together. We work together. And so to think about this in isolation, if in fact he moves ahead with this tariff against Canada, I think that throws out that argument about defense, because I don't believe it, because Canada and the U.S. are together in defense.
One of the things that the U.S. president is doing is using basically a national security loophole in an attempt to target China. But from what I understand, this loophole, you can't just target specific countries. So if you increase tariffs on China, you have to increase on other countries as well. And one of the things that Canada is asking for is to be granted an exemption. How likely do you think that is?
I can't predict the president of the United States and what he's doing. I mean, you know, I think that those of us in the U.S. Would love to be able to find a path to be able to predict what decisions he will or won't make. You know, if he does proceed with these tariffs, it will have a significant impact on Canada, but it will more importantly have a significant impact on our relationship. We're friends, but we're even more than friends. We're family. We share this common 5,525-mile border, but we are so integrated in our supply chains. We are integrated in how we approach democracy around the world. We're integrated in everything that we do. And he's trying to build lines, build walls. And if it's not a real wall, it's trying to build a virtual wall. And, you know, it's disturbing to me to see this path. Unfortunately, that's the direction that he seems to be going.
But, you know, you and I were chatting before we got on camera earlier today, and you were saying one of the things that he's so good at doing is appealing to his base and also following through on what he says he's going to do.
Right.
Do you think his base even understands how dangerous this bit of policy can be?
No, the sophistication of the base. And that base, by the way, exists on either extreme of both parties. So you'll have very, very liberal Democrats thinking this is a good idea, and very right-wing Republicans thinking this is a good idea. So this populist appeal in thinking about protectionism and bringing it all home in creating these jobs, they don't understand the complexity of our world economic model that exists today that has been so prosperous for us since World War II. And unfortunately, you know, if we sit down and try to explain to people, they're going to say, well, NAFTA's bad for me. Or, you know, you guys are manufacturing when we should be manufacturing, and they don't understand how supply chains work and why working together is like 1 + 1 is 3.
Beneficial on both sides of the border.
Yeah.
Mr. Heyman, thank you so much. Always great having you on.
Pleasure, Omar.
Appreciate it. And now for his analysis on the situation, Ken Newman, who is the Canada National Director for United Steelworkers. Great to have you on, Mr. Newman. How nervous are you right now? How apprehensive?
Well, very much concerned. I mean, just listening to some of your guests, the fact is I just returned from the U.S. After spending 3 or 4 days there and been right in the thick of things. And it's unconscionable, or it's hard to comprehend the fact is that you think that the president is going to possibly choose an option other than the total exemption of Canada. I mean, all the evidence clearly is very clear with respect to Canada is not the problem. As I was telling some people today, I just traveled back from the U.S. As you know, there's been some tough conditions on the road, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of trucks. They're going both ways, and I can assure you that none of those trucks were being empty, that these are goods that are crossing our borders every day to the tune of $2 billion. And if you look at the integrated market that we've had for all those years, if you look at auto, you look at manufacturing, we've been one of the best neighbors, and Canada's not the problem. As you know, that the U.S. exports more steel into Canada than the other way around. And we have a very efficient industry, and it's hard to comprehend. So yes, there's some nervousness there. Hopefully he'll have some time to look at some of his advisors. We've had evidence from some of his key people that say that, look, at Canada should be excluded, and hopefully when you look at the facts and you look at really what's at stake, that basically he comes to the right decision and excludes us because there's a long history of decades where we had this integrated market. And as your previous guest has said, it's going to also affect workers in the U.S. as well. And as we represent members on both sides of the border with some of the same companies, we have Arcelor, we have Tenaris, we have Everaz. These companies employ steelworkers both in Canada and the United States. They pay good, decent wages, and the fact is that thousands of workers are at risk because of it's hard to predict what he's going to do. And I agree.
But how do you convince? Certainly an issue that affects workers on both sides of the border. But how do you convince the U.S. president that Canada is not the problem?
Well, all he has to do is look at the evidence, look at some of his advisors, look at the crucial evidence from
But this is an individual to whom evidence has been presented before, and he doesn't seem to acknowledge it or take stock of it.
Well, then I think it's up to if in fact they're going to bring in tariffs or slap tariffs on Canada, it's up to our government to take a very, very strong stand that we're not going to be bullied. If he's trying to use this as leverage for the upcoming or the current negotiations with NAFTA, we shouldn't play that game. The fact is that our government has to take a very firm stand and protect the interests of our Canadian workers and our Canadian industry. The history is long. There's $1 trillion of trade that goes through in a particular year. It's being targeted for all the wrong reasons. And like I say, it's hard to predict what he's going to do, but if he's going to do the right thing and follow the advice and look at what it could do to the relationship between Canada and the United States, it can be very harmful. So hopefully they make that decision.
What do you think of the Canadian response so far? Do you think it is aggressive enough?
I think the government has stepped up to the plate and saying that, look, do the right thing. Canada should be exempt for all the reasons that I've explained. I think that we have to go one step further. That if in fact that they do bring in the tariffs, we have an obligation, because if those tariffs are going to be imposed to these countries that are bad actors and don't play by the rules, they have excess capacity, such as China. They produce 1.2 billion tons of steel. They only utilize roughly around 700 million tons. That steel is going to be looking for a home, and that home probably is going to try to come to our borders, and that's where our government has to stand up and do the right thing to make sure that we have, we have the transparency to make sure that we don't allow that steel in. So the government has to really step up to make sure that it's monitored, that steel, if they're going to try to look after those bad actors, they're going to try to find a new home, and that home should not be Canada. I understand about fair trade. I think that that's the other thing governments have to look at. When we negotiate these trade deals, somehow we end up negotiating trade deals with countries that don't respect workers, don't respect the environment, and don't respect human rights. And sometimes all you have to do is look in the mirror, and that's why we're in the mess we're at. But between Canada and the United States, by far, his own advisors and everybody, it's not the problem.
All right, Mr. Newman, I got to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time. Anxious days for you. I appreciate your making the time.
Thanks for having me.